Welcome back, all. Dr. JC here, Lecture 12, Part 2. Please know that this is going to be the final part. I know I mentioned previously in Part 1 that there'd be 3 short parts. I said that and then I went ahead and talked about 10 or 12 minutes on the Ottomans. What I am going to do, though, is really abbreviate the lectures here on the Safavids and the Mughals, keep these each to about 5 minutes. This is not to imply that the Safavids and the Mughals are less important or impactful than the Ottomans, although from a historical standpoint, the Ottomans were a much longer lasting empire and a much more powerful empire. So with that, we're going to go ahead and take a few minutes and talk about the Safavids. Would be modern day Iran, and then the Mughals, modern day India. One of the first things I'd like to point out and have you remember is that the Safavids are this bridge between ancient Persia and modern day Iran. From a time standpoint, we're talking about roughly around 1500 to 1740, with the Safavids seeing their height or greatest moment, as it were, under Shah Abbas, and we'll talk about Shah Abbas here in a minute, in the end of the 1500s, early 1600s. So not a really long-lasting empire, and there are reasons for that, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Just as I had asked that you remember Suleiman the Magnificent and associate him with the Ottoman Empire, I'm going to ask that you remember Shah Abbas here and associate him with the Safavid dynasty or empire. Unlike Western Europe, where monarchs, whether they be kings or queens, look to curry favor amongst the nobility as a way to retain their power and create a power structure, didn't work that way here in the Near East, at least as it relates to the Safavid Empire. Shah Abbas, however, decided that it was in his interest to do so, and he would begin to gain support from nobles by appointing different ethnic peoples as senior officials within his political administration as a way to go ahead and maintain their support. Part of the reason he's doing this is because there are severe threats from the Ottoman Turks and from Uzbekistan, or the Uzbeks, along his border. Therefore, he needs to maintain strong control at home, gain favor with various ethnic groups within his border, strengthen his ties with those ethnic groups within his borders so that he can expand his military and then push back against the Uzbeks and the Ottomans. In fact, one of the lasting legacies associated with Shah Abbas will be his leadership in the Ottoman War. The Ottoman War is going to take place roughly 1603 to about 1618, so a pretty long, protracted war. But the Safavids under Shah Abbas are eventually going to push the Ottomans back and the Uzbekis back and expand their borders. And this is a win not only for Shah Abbas, but for Shia Islam as well. Because under Shah Abbas, we're going to see the Shiite Muslim denomination take firm control and hold of Iran, something that still exists and lasts to present day. Prior to getting into the reasons of the decline of the Safavid Empire, I'd be remiss if I failed to mention, too, that Shah Abbas wasn't just successful in expanding borders to the northwest against the Uzbeks and the Ottomans. He was also successful expanding his borders to the east and southeast against the Mughals, fellow Muslims, and Christians, the Portuguese. The Portuguese had begun to establish colonies along the Indian coast, and Shah Abbas was able to have some success against them as well. So a very successful leader, very successful guy. We're talking about late 1500s to the early 1600s, so fully 100 years before we start to see the decline of the Safavid Empire. And for those interested in Shah Abbas, I'd ask that you read more about him. Interesting guy, to be sure. As it relates to Safavid decline, this isn't going to happen overnight. And there are several different reasons for the empire's demise, all right? And some of those I'd ask that if you're interested to go ahead and research. I've included a few of them here. That said, I'm going to focus in on one or two key points here because I happen to think that these tend to be the most impactful and most long-lasting as well. The two overarching points that did have an impact on decline are one, geography, and two, the theocratic nature of Shahs who would come behind Shah Abbas. So from roughly about early 1600 to the early 1700s, you see each successive Shah tends to become a little bit more theocratic, and we'll talk about that here in a minute, and the impact of that. From a geographic standpoint, these guys were quite literally and figuratively caught between a rock and a hard place. This is a landlocked empire, which means they don't have a navy. Therefore, you rely on overland routes for trade. Well, those overland routes happen to go through neighboring lands, and your neighboring lands are enemies of yours. The Ottomans on one side, the Mughals, and to some extent, Christian communities like the Portuguese on the other side. So from a geographic sense, it just did not suit well for these guys to be a long-lasting empire. Perhaps more importantly, though, and one that would accelerate the decline, because it would bring about a loss of hearts and minds, a loss of faith and trust in the leadership of the Safavid Empire, had to deal with the religious nature of these shahs. As is the case in many theocracies, and when we're talking about a theocracy, we're talking about a religious center to the form of governance, all right? So that religion and governance are one and the same, more or less. And it's always more spiritually based than it is, say, civilly based. So if there are laws to be put into place across society, they tend to be much more religious focused than they do civil or secular. And over time, what's going to happen is that each of these succeeding shahs is going to apply Shia Muslim doctrine to all aspects of Safavid life. This is a problem for some ethnic groups along the borders within the Safavid Empire who happen to be Sunni Muslims. How about your academic leaders? You no longer have the ability to do free open dialogue, free thought, free discussion on campuses. That's not the case anymore. Your free speech is going to start to be taken away from you. So that over time, what would happen is that the Safavid leadership distanced itself from the people, therefore lost its hearts and minds. And whenever you've lost the hearts and minds of your own people, good luck maintaining that empire, especially when you have neighbors on either side of you that don't like you and want more of your lands. So while hardly an exhaustive list of reasons for Safavid decline here, these are some of the reasons that help bring that about. For those interested in reading more about the decline, please do so. There's plenty of information out there for you, and I would ask that you look into that. We'll pivot next into what was going to be part 3, but it's going to be now part of part 2 here, the Mughal Empire. As intimated in the lecture with the Safavids, I talked about Portuguese contact, European contact with the Mughal Empire. Understand, and this is sort of a spoiler alert for everybody already, right? The Mughal Empire becomes this sort of great what if, because they really looked like they were positioned to become this crazy powerhouse, but they ran into European technology, they ran into Europeans, most specifically and eventually the British Empire. So when we talk about the Mughal Empire, we're really talking about roughly the mid-1500s to the mid-1800s. So 300 years, pretty long lasting, and they again become this what if, because if it hadn't been for the British Empire, we're left with this, wow, what would this Mughal Empire have perhaps evolved into? Just as we have Suleiman the Magnificent in the Ottoman Empire and Shah Abbas with the Safavids, there are two names I want you to associate with the Mughal Empire. The first will be Babur. We'll talk about Babur very briefly, and Akbar. So Babur and Akbar are the two individuals I'd like you to associate with the Mughal Empire. The first because why? He is the founder and first ruler of the Mughal Empire. He's the individual that's going to start to bring this great empire together. And Akbar, the third of the Mughal leaders, is going to be the individual that helps bring about some serious lasting changes and becomes this great example of rule through toleration. And we'll talk about in some cases reasons why he had to move in that direction. One glaring one, the so-styled elephant in the room, pun intended, in this region of the world, right, has to be the fact that this is a Muslim empire in a land that most of us would think is pretty dadgum Hindu, yes? Just like Cyrus the Great and Alexander the Great, and Suleiman to some extent, Akbar will also come to be known as Akbar the Magnificent because he is a warrior philosopher of sorts. This is a very successful general that is open and inquisitive, tends to like the arts as much as he does the sciences, And therefore, in that regard, he brings together the warrior and the philosopher, and that's going to have a huge impact on the direction of the Mughal Empire itself. As an example of this rule through toleration, we can look at the administrative reforms that Akbar puts into place. Here's a guy that recognizes, look, we're Muslims in a land that is peopled with lots of different individuals that have different spiritual faiths. There are plenty of Hindus here for sure. There are Buddhists. There are even Christians in these lands. And if I want to win the hearts and minds of these people, I got to start to do some serious reform. One of the first things he's going to do is get rid of this tax, a tax against anybody that's not Muslim. So if you remember that jizya or special head tax that was put into place by other Muslim dynasties, he gets rid of that here. He opens his administration to non-Muslims. You can be Buddhist, you can be Hindu, you can be Christian. I don't care if you've got merit and talent. I want you working for us. I want you helping the people. And as a result of this, you can clearly see how easy it would be to win hearts and minds. And he does that. So again, a great example of rule through toleration here rather than fear. And that sets the Mughal dynasty up or empire up on this trajectory of, wow, where could it go? Enter Europeans, most specifically the British. Before talking about the impact of the British, which ultimately is going to be decline here for the Mughal Empire, and that's going to happen as a natural byproduct of trade and commerce, I wanted to talk about the business or economic impact of social policy. When Akbar began to apply these social changes, he invited more talent, he invited more investment. This is a stable government now. Outside countries are going to be interested in investing here, and they do. And as a result of that, the economy will begin to really become quite robust. So while Akbar's reign will be roughly 1550 to the early 1600s, economic growth and expansion of the Mughal Empire is going to take place quite a bit for the next 100 years into the 1700s. Therefore, the social changes and economic changes wrought by Akbar truly had a long-lasting effect and impact on not just the Mughal Empire, but the growth and descendancy of the Mughal Empire in relation to those other gunpowder empires, the Safavids and the Ottomans. And because of that economic ascendancy, because of the social reforms, because of the more tolerant rule, it's for those reasons that some historians and others refer to the Mughal Empire as the greatest of Muslim empires, especially as it relates to the Indian subcontinent. As a part of this great what if that the Mughals become, we're going to introduce the British here and the British influence. The British were no different than any other Europeans. Look, they're trying to somehow take control of, or at least command, the trade from the Far East back to the West, whether it's silk from China, spices from Indonesia, or the great inventions and innovations we've talked about associated with India itself. Cashmere, steel, confectionery sugars, you name it. India happened to be a good stopping point. And in some sense, it became a sort of crossroads from a naval perspective between the East and the West, just as the Ottoman Empire would become a crossroads between East and West overland. Over time, however, the British East India Company would look to gain clear control of the trade and then eventually the land and total control of the Indian subcontinent. And I would invite those of you to read more about this if you're interested in it. The key battle between the British East India Company and the Mughal government, or taking control of India more specifically, happened to take place in 1857, just on the eve of the American Civil War, at the Battle of Plassey, where Robert Clive, a leading member of the British East India Company, is able to subdue the Mughal forces, and as a result of that, wrest control of India. And the rest will be history, quite frankly, until we talk about the Indian National Congress and Indian independence movement, and that's part of the second half of this course. That'll take place after World War II. I'm hoping these two parts here have whet your appetite enough to do a little bit more digging on the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals, because they are important, these so-styled gunpowder empires. Dr. JC out. Lecture 12.